Hello again. Following the previous video where I talked about fiction and a little bit about poetry and structure of writing fictional picture books or novels, I thought we'd take a closer look right now at nonfiction. I love nonfiction. I didn't think I'd ever say that because I always thought that using your imagination to come up with a fictional story would be a lot more fun. But I've discovered over the years that I'm quite passionate about writing nonfiction because you will find a topic that you get excited about that you'd like to share with kids. And then there's nothing more fun than to delve into that topic and do a lot of research and discover things. You're learning all the time when you're writing nonfiction, not just when you're reading it. I think with nonfiction, it's a little bit different. It's quite different actually from writing fiction. It still starts with an idea. The writer needs an idea, and with nonfiction, you tend to, if you're looking for a regular trade publisher, I think nonfiction is more common to pitch that to the publisher before you do all the research and the writing. So you would contact the publisher and say, I have this brilliant idea. This is what I plan to do. You'd have a whole plan and how many pages and what ages. And again, the voice is very important in nonfiction. But you would pitch that before you do all the writing if you're looking for a publisher. If you're writing a book for your students, I don't know if fiction is easier for you than nonfiction, but I think they both offer a wealth of possibilities, sharing information and modeling the joy of writing with your students. So if you get a good idea, it could be because you are already knowledgeable about a really cool topic. Nonfiction can be about anything. Maybe you know a lot about mushrooms or planets or birds or the history of a certain period, or you want to explain how something works. The voice is important. A nonfiction book should not be something that kids can just Google and find the same information. You need to really present it in a unique way that makes kids want to turn the page as much as reading a fictional book would. So once you know the topic that you'd like to research and write about, think about how are you going to present that information. And it can be that you're already the expert about a topic that you'd like to share. Maybe you're a great photographer and you want to share how-tos with the kids. But maybe you don't know much about it, but you're just curious about writing it. Years and years ago, I had a phone call from an educational bookstore saying, we know you write books for kids. There's a real niche in the market for something about spiders. We don't have anything about spiders. And my first reaction was, I'm the wrong person for that. I hate spiders. But then I thought, well, if they don't have anything, that might mean that they're going to sell a lot of books. And so I went to the library and I brought home piles of books and I did a lot of research about spiders. And I found out really cool stuff. I didn't know that baby spiders are called spiderlings, and sometimes 100 baby spiders live on the back of one mother. And when they're ready to leave their home, they make little silk parachutes and they sail off into the world. And so I'm actually not scared of spiders after doing all that research. So maybe you already know a lot about it. Maybe you don't know, but the research is going to allow you to share a lot of cool stuff with kids. And sometimes a book isn't very clear cut. Is this fiction or is this nonfiction? Sometimes it's realistic fiction. So even if you have a lot of knowledge about one specific subject, you could use the real information and turn it into a fictional book. I did that with a series of early novels. These are first novels when kids are first going from picture books to reading chapter books. And this one is based on a trip that my own kids took when they were in grade 4. They went on a field trip to a dinosaur museum, and they had all these mishaps and crazy adventures that if I'd made it up, people would say, oh, that's so weird, but it really all happened. So I just took the real things that happened to my kids, made up for new kids. And so it's fiction because it's not about the real kids. And I didn't record their dialogue. I made up the dialogue, so it's realistic fiction. This one is based on the years that I spent living in Oregon in exactly this old ghost house, and all the things that happened to the same kids from the other book during the summer they spent here are things that really happened to me, and they were also weird and wacky that I thought they'd make a great story. Even a book that seems like nonfiction, like this one, this is one of my books that has been making waves all over the world, and I know a lot of schools are using this, both for the content and as a fundraiser to support refugees in different countries. This book is really fiction because I made up the family and the child that the story is about. But it was a wonderful story in that I spotted this image on Facebook one year, and it just blew me away that that image was made solely with rocks. It took me 3 months to contact the illustrator, who lives in Syria, who had no money for glue or paint or anything else, and he uses rocks to make images. And when I saw those on his Facebook page, I asked his permission to use the images that he had already made. So this book was done all backwards because usually I don't have the art until the text is finished. But I wrote a text about a fictional refugee family. The book was published in English and in Arabic. It's come out in, I don't know, about 14 languages. It's out in Dutch, steen for steen, in German, in Turkish, in Korean, in Japanese, in many different languages. And that means people in all those countries are using the book and discussing refugees. It's a hit in Vietnam. And what I discovered after the book came out that I love is that people identify with the story because, like, kids in Vietnam said, this is our story, it's about us. And I thought, I wrote it about Syrian kids that I met here in Canada. But because they're stones, they're not people of any race or religion or specific language. They're universal. And so I'm really thrilled that people recognize themselves in this story. But ultimately, it's realistic fiction. If you write nonfiction, finding that voice and an appealing angle is really important. That's what I love about this book. I didn't write this book. It's written by Claire Emer. And instead of saying, I'm going to write about the origins of food, she started with a lunchbox that every kid has. What's in your lunchbox? And then she relates that back to different countries and eras and the history of all that food that is in kids' lunchboxes. The subtitle is The Wacky History and the Weird Science of Everyday Food. So that's an example of finding a good angle. This is a series by Orca Books, which is one of my publishers. The series is called Orca Footprints. And they're talking about water and climate change and trash and electricity and topics that kids might be interested in. Gives them lots of information, lots of activities, but it's all based on a topic that the author is passionate about. I had done a lot of nature-based books, A Mountain Alphabet, a book called When We Go Camping, In My Backyard is about urban animals. And in doing all the research for previous books, I found so much cool information that I collected all that and I did a book just with really cool blow-away facts about different animals. So I had a lot of fun putting that together as a nonfiction book. This is one of my favorite nonfiction books. So this is a good example of getting an idea and doing the research and writing a book. I read a newspaper article in the Vancouver Sun in Canada, and the article years ago said that in Kenya, people were using a camel to deliver books to people in outlying communities that had no access to books. Very poor schools in Kenya. People had no books in their homes. And the National Library of Kenya decided it was their duty to bring books to everyone. So they collected books, put them in boxes, and then they said, now, how are we going to distribute these books? And they said, let's use a camel. And so when I read that in the paper, that's when I got the idea. I thought, if kids in Kenya get a book delivered by camel, how else in the world do people bring books to others? And how do they do that, and what do they use? So I went to the library to look for books on that topic, and I couldn't find anything. So then I went to the internet, and I had no idea when I got that idea that it would take me 8 years of research. But it took me 8 years to collect all the stories, the photos, the information that is in this book of how people bring books to kids in many different countries all over the world. It was tedious. It was contacting librarians and teachers. It was trying to get photos. It was pulling teeth. But the result of my 8 years of research is a book that is now part of the U.S. Common Core curriculum, and I think it's in every school in the U.S. So it's been worth it, and it's very exciting that kids are still using it and love it, and often adopt a library in another country and then ship books to that project. And so I'm doing a lot of matchmaking still with well-to-do schools and kids that want to do fundraising and have an impact in global service, and connecting them to libraries that really need it. Like the floating school in Cambodia that I just recently visited, and that really needs books and support. Similarly, but without photos, it looks more like fiction. I have a whole series of these books called Around the World Books, Schools. There's a book called Families Around the World. I can't remember now if I told you about that book last time. I thought I did. Yeah, I think I did. So this one is similar. It's a different illustrator, but they're all made with paper collage. And it shows how kids go to school all over the world and how those are different situations. The last book in this series is called Birthdays Around the World. Same shape, same size. But what was very exciting about that book is that it just came out all across Canada as a McDonald's Happy Meal book. So instead of getting a plastic toy, kids were getting a book about birthdays all over the world and how they're celebrated. And that too, it would take me at least 2 years to do a simple book where I'm interviewing people and talking to people. Similar to doing a biography. I have a bunch of biographies. This one is about Canada's most famous wildlife painter, Robert Bateman. And this is the story of his life. And so I wanted to show kids that they can follow their passion. And that's what he did to become a painter. So these are his paintings. And sometimes there are black and white photos of his childhood, but it's the story of how he grew into a painter that is recognized all over the world. So I had to do a lot of research, watch every film and documentary, read all his books, talk to him, of course, read every book that he has written, and compile that into a picture book of very few words. So every word is important. Which words are redundant? Which words are important? Does it matter what year he was born? Does it matter that he's married and how many kids he has? Or are there other things that are more important to show in a biography? So writing biographies can be fun, but also challenging. And sometimes I don't know where the ideas are coming from, and I'm not specifically looking for ideas. One year I was visiting international schools in Kenya and Ethiopia and Tanzania, and I stopped in Zambia to do a wildlife safari, and an idea hit me over the head that I wasn't really looking for. This book was ultimately published by Kids Can Press, and they have a series called Citizen Kid, and I love their book. If you're using nonfiction books with students, look at Citizen Kid books. They include If the World Were a Village, and I think one of my favorite picture books is called One Hen. It's about micro-lending and a chicken and eggs, and how this real boy, it's a true story, nonfiction, changed his life with One Hen. I learned about this real boy who grew up in a poaching community. He explained to me why and how all that worked, and then how he became an elephant keeper in an elephant orphanage in Zambia. So this book is a little bit different format from usual. The illustrator did paintings, and it tells the true story, but then the story is interrupted by a page of nonfiction information with photos, and those are mostly photos that I took, and then the story continues. So it's a picture book almost in chapters. So you can have different formats and different ways of presenting your material, but like I said, doing nonfiction, you usually pitch it first with a publisher, and then you work with an editor to make sure you're doing all this work in the right format and the right voice. So that's a little bit about nonfiction. When you are doing your research to write nonfiction, even if it's just for you to use with your students and not for publication, it's a good idea to keep track of where you find your information, so that you have a bibliography of your resources. If you later say, well, how did I know that? Where did I find that? It's a good idea to keep track of that. If you have any questions about writing nonfiction, be sure to ask me, because there's so much we could be touching on. So I thought we would also now look at what if you do want to see if you can get your writing published, because you're going to spend a lot of time working on it. And kids often say, now what? How can I share this writing? I used to have an online magazine for 18 years in which I shared writing with kids all over the world, and they could get it published online. So that's a good way for you if your students want to now share the poem or the story they have written, is tag a page onto your school's website and call it Our Authors or Young Authors or Student Writers, and see if you can share their writing online so that the students' grandparents in Florida can read what your students in India wrote, and make their writing more accessible to an audience. If you are looking at finding a publisher, I go to the library and I see who has written something that is similar to my fiction, my nonfiction, and I look at that small print page to see when this book was published, who published it. There's always website and a mailing address. And on the website are most likely the publishing guidelines for that publisher. So they'll tell you if they're open to getting non-solicited, unsolicited manuscripts. And you can always approach them and ask if they would like to see it. It takes a long time. When I get an idea and say that it's nonfiction, right now I had an idea to write a book with maps. I have a grandson who is crazy about maps. He loves nothing better than treasure hunts and making maps of the house and the property. And so I thought, what if I did a book of maps? So I found kids, real kids, in about 16 different countries, maybe 18. And I asked all those kids about their daily life. Where do you live in this city? Show me on a map. How do you get from your home to school? What else in your neighborhood do you stop at? Do you go to a bakery? Do you go to the grocery store? Do you have dance classes after school? What do you do in the weekends? Are there parks? What do you do? So all this information from all these real kids in all these very different, unique settings all over the world. One lives in a hutong in Beijing. One lives on an atoll in the South Pacific. One lives on a houseboat in Amsterdam. One lives in, can you believe this, in Patagonia, at the South Pole. I didn't even know there were people living there, but I found a village in Antarctica. So their whole neighborhood, how do they travel around their neighborhood, is in this book. So I had the idea, pitched it to the publisher. The publisher said yes. Usually they say no. All writers get rejections, even J.K. Rowling. Once the publisher says yes, with a nonfiction book, they will give me more guidelines. This is what we envision. This is how many pages you can do, how many countries. So I get a lot of guidance then from the publisher. So I start all my research, sending emails to India and the South Pacific, asking questions. Then I have to wait and get it back. Sometimes they don't speak English. So I'm talking to people like in Antarctica. It was Chilean Antarctica, and they didn't speak a word of English, only Spanish. So I did all my correspondence through Google Translate. I was pasting all this Spanish and getting it back and pasting it to see what she wrote me back. So very interesting ways of doing research. And then I have to find the maps of the neighborhood. I have to protect the kids' identities, so I have to change things a little bit to make sure you don't see exactly where this kid lives. I want to use different languages in the books, so I have to make sure that I don't make spelling mistakes, that I give the pronunciation correctly. So that's a fairly simple picture book, but it'll take me 2 or 3 years of writing and researching and going back and forth and sending it to the editor, and then the editor has more questions and more changes. And finally, after 2 or 3 years, when I finish the text, then it's up to the publisher to find an illustrator. I don't know any of the illustrators of my books. Sometimes I've met them afterwards, but often I have not. And that's normal, I would say, for 95% of picture books. The author and the illustrator don't know each other. We don't collaborate. We have a publisher in between. So I talk to the publisher relays that to the illustrator. I upload photos of elephants in Zambia that the illustrator can access and use to make sure the art is all correct. But we don't talk to each other at all. And that's pretty normal. So if you ever do a writing of picture books with students, it's a really cool exercise to have students write a story, give it to you. You are the publisher, the teacher, and then the teacher assigns text to different students, or even trade with another classroom who then become the illustrators of the kids' writing. And then when you get it back, you see how different it is from what you imagined. In real life, it's always better than I could imagine because these illustrators are fabulous and I don't need to talk to them if my writing works. So, but it's interesting to see what they add to your text and how it changes. The title of a book is up to the publisher ultimately. They do research on does this title already exist, or is it a good title? Do we need a different title? Let's see what we haven't talked about yet. Kids always say, how much money do you make? And the teachers say, oh, you can't ask that. But I think it's a good question because, well, let's look at those novels that I wrote. These novels cost $7 in the books. If you go to the bookstore, this one's $7. The writer and the illustrator get royalties, and those royalties are 10% of a book. So then I asked the kids, how much is 10% of $7? And they say, ew, you only get 70 cents. I say, no, I have to share that with the illustrator. So writers get 5% of the retail price of a book. So you have to sell a lot of books to be able to afford living as a writer or an illustrator, because it took me 2 or 3 years. So it's a good idea if you want to get published to not quit your teaching job for a while and keep teaching and start writing on the side, because it is the most wonderful thing to do. And of course, you may never look for a publisher. You might just be interested in writing in the classroom. Here's a wonderful book that I wanted to show you, that when I visited an international school in Burma, Myanmar, the students had this fantastic project where the teacher did research. The students wrote an alphabet book about Myanmar. The kids illustrated. They actually had the school secretary translate the English into Burmese. And then they had a grant to publish these books. And when I visited the school, after that, I was going to do some sightseeing in Myanmar. And they gave me a stack of books and said, can you hand those out wherever you go? So they printed these picture books and then had them in the local language and shared them with kids for free. So wherever we went, we were handing out books to kids that had maybe never owned a book. So keep that in mind when you're doing projects with your students, that maybe you can have your students write an alphabet book about whatever country you're in. It doesn't need to be an alphabet book. It could be an African legend that they make up. Could be nonfiction. It could be poetry, although poetry is difficult to translate. But once you have the book done and the art is done by students, see if you can't produce multiple copies and have somebody translate it in the local language and have students hand them out. There's lots of amazing projects, like Room to Read is in many countries producing books in the local language, building libraries, supporting schools with books. There's Ethiopia Reads, a similar mobile library project, but also now producing books. So lots of ways that you can connect your students in writing to the local population and supporting kids who might not be as fortunate and not have access to books in the same way that your students do. So I hope that you take books into the classroom always, because I don't think there's anything better than using real books in the classroom. Get your students excited about reading, but then model and get them excited about doing their own writing, just like you're doing. And then take that writing a step beyond the classroom and the school and bring an audience to them that's a real authentic audience and a real reason for your students to write. So I hope you have lots of fun with books. I think the sky is the limit. I look forward to hearing some of your comments and questions. And read a good book in bed tonight. Goodbye.